Do a quick roll call. Mark Klecker is not here today. He's absent. I'm functioning as chair today, Rich Spiker. I am obviously present. Tony? Thank you. Colin?
Present.
Mary Karen?
Sorry. Jason?
I am here.
Thank you. Need to approve the meeting minutes from April 16th, 2004.
Motion to approve. I'll second.
Motion and a second. All in favor,
Aye.
signify by saying aye. Aye. Zoning ordinance amendments. Jake, you want to
Yeah, I'll get the ball
lead
rolling.
things off?
Thank you. So, obviously over the past couple months, we've been having discussions about several of the functional areas of the zoning ordinance. And some draft materials have been presented back and forth internally. We've reviewed a lot of discussion last month about a lot of the residential uses, whether it's group housing or childcare, looking at our existing uses and definitions and where they are permitted. What I've prepared in response to those conversations and discussions is what I think is a pretty good version of where the amendments need to take place on the residential side of things as far as permitted uses are concerned. So what I've provided is a draft to everybody. And then also, this is the use matrix for the entire city with all of our current uses on it. I know it's probably a little difficult to read, but it's a good reference for when we're bouncing around as opposed to looking at 17 different pages of the zoning ordinance and various sections. One of the things that we might as well get right into it. Then we can discuss some of the other functional areas that we've also been talking about that I don't have a draft for presentation. But let's go through this first and see where we're at with this. I'll just get right into the recommended amendments. And I'll go district by district, which is how it's organized. So on page 2 of the draft, you'll see that what we're recommending, and this has been discussed with the solicitor's office, Article 204 contains all of the use districts and the permitted uses in those districts. So again, this is focusing on the residential districts or largely the residential uses. And what we're suggesting at this point, we do want to add a new use that's called accessory dwelling unit. That goes back to our conversations the last couple months. As you can see, it's been added to the use matrix, and essentially it's been added to, just as a use, it's been added to all of the residential districts, essentially. Including waterfront residential district, which is a conversation we'll have when we get to that district, which is fairly significant. But in addition to adding that as a permitted use in R1, it was also suggested to add community garage. Per our last discussion on the updating our child daycare regulations, we needed to create this group daycare home and add that group daycare home into the residential districts to line up with the state's child daycare definitions. So that's been added. Group homes has been moved from special exception to permitted. Neighborhood center has been moved from special exception to permitted. Planned residential development has been moved from special exception to permitted, and short-term rental, suggestion to move from special exception to permitted. That goes with 1 and 2 of section 1 changes there. In 3 and 4 of the recommended changes are very similar. This is for R1A. We would be adding accessory dwelling unit, group child daycare home, group homes, neighborhood center, planned residential development, and short-term rental, adding those as permitted uses, and removing the group homes, neighborhood center, planned residential development, short-term rental from as special exception uses. Going to the R2 district, again, adding accessory dwelling unit. We are proposing to add a few more permitted uses to R2 than are currently there. Those would include adult daycare, funeral homes, the new group child care, daycare home definition or use, group homes, market garden, personal care boarding homes, PRDs, and rooming and boarding homes, adding those to our list of permitted uses in R2. And as far as some of those uses are currently listed as special exceptions, which would then be removed from the special exception category, that would be group homes, market garden, PRD. In the R3 zoning district, again, adding the new uses of ADU and the group child daycare home, and also adding daycare centers, dormitories, fraternities, sororities, group care facilities, hospitals, market garden, nursing homes, PRDs, retirement communities, and rooming houses would all be added to the permitted use list in R3. Several of those uses are currently listed in R3 as special exceptions, so those would be removed from that category. That includes daycare centers, dormitories, fraternity sororities, hospitals, market garden, nursing homes, PRDs, retirement homes, and rooming houses. Moving on to the next page into the RLB, which is the Residential Limited Business Zoning District. Again, adding ADUs, dorms, family child daycare home, which just for some reason was not listed there, in addition to the group child daycare home, fraternity, sorority, market garden, and nursing homes. A few of those uses are currently listed as special exceptions, and which would be removed from that category. That includes dormitories, fraternity, sororities, market gardens, and nursing homes. So those are existing residential categories other than waterfront residential. And, you know, obviously the theme here is that we're trying to make the permitted uses more expansive in all of the residential districts. And adding a couple of new uses to the residential districts that have not been there previously. With regards to the waterfront residential district, you know, currently all the waterfront districts all of the uses are currently listed as conditional uses, which requires going through that conditional use approval process, which, you know, we've all participated in. I think the general consensus has been, in my experience and in our conversations, is that the residential uses in the waterfront districts perhaps should not have to go through this conditional use approval process. It seems like we've also had consensus that, you know, commercial uses probably should still, you know, larger scale commercial uses probably should still be following that process. So there is attention to the design details and more public forum and public comment opportunity for that. But with regards to residential, what's suggested or recommended at this point is to add the ADU use, create a permitted use category in WR, which does not exist now. And then in that permitted use category, add ADU, accessory uses, 1 family dwellings, 2 family dwellings, child daycare home, group daycare home, home child care, home occupations, off-street parking lots, and short-term rental. The only thing, and of course, the conditional uses would be amended to remove those uses that are currently listed as conditional. The only thing that's maybe quasi-commercial would be, on that list, would be off-street parking. However, I think it's fair to point out that off-street parking lots do have rigorous design standards, and in particular, waterfront design standards that require green lots and landscaping and things like that. And those requirements will still need to be met, even though it's listed as a permitted use versus conditional. So it's similar to a special exception where there are conditions to these uses that are outlined in the book. It's just a matter of the administrative process to approve those uses. All the conditions in the book still need to be adhered to, no question about it, but this helps to streamline the process, the approval process, so it can be done administratively versus going in front of the zoning hearing board or council.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things is that particularly in the residential spaces, that these permitted uses that we're putting in there, I mean, before it was essentially a rubber stamp, as long as they checked the boxes. We weren't going to block them as long as they met those conditions, and a lot of these are the types of things that, frankly, are going to help build stronger community. It makes it so people don't have to relocate, or there are new opportunities in these areas. So I think, obviously I'm biased, but I think it's definitely a positive step for Erie.
I'd like to just real quick discuss the ADUs and which zones we're allowing them.
Yes.
I agree with all the ones that we are indicating we're permitting them to, but I'd also like to suggest that we add C1 local commercial,
Okay.
C4 traditional neighborhood commercial, and M1 light manufacturing to allow ADUs.
Excuse me, we can't.
Sorry, you're not hearing me? Sorry, Kathy. I'm trying to talk in the microphone. I was not close enough. I was talking about how I think the ADU should also be permitted in C1, C4, and M1, which are kind of the lighter uses for commercial and manufacturing. I do recall about a year ago watching a zoning hearing board meeting, and there was a gentleman requesting to live in his manufacturing facility, and that seemed like one of those, who cares? Who's this affecting negatively? Why not let the guy live in his factory if he wants to? And I would think that would fall under M1.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think it's to your point, who's negatively affected by it.
Yeah, I'm thinking in C1 local commercial, those are mostly those like corner store kind of commercials. So it's reasonable that, especially in the older neighborhoods, that there could be already an ADU on those lots, or in those buildings. Some of those are kind of chopped up, the front and back half kind of. So those are my suggestions for those three additional zones.
Yeah, and I agree. I know that there are residential uses listed in our commercial districts also, and I didn't go as far as to go through each district and modify all of the permitted uses in each zoning district. This was fairly limited to the residential districts, but that was one of the areas that I immediately thought of also is, we should probably be looking at ADU, adding that in. So that's a perfect amendment.
So
that
do
can put
we
in here.
want to maybe treat that, do we want to address that in this, or, I mean, based on the conversations we were having right before this meeting, there's some stuff for, light manufacturing, light industrial, that some zoning changes we want to look at there too, that we can plan to incorporate it in. I mean, it's 6 of one, half a dozen the other. I'm just thinking that we know we need to look at that even
With
more
the
broadly.
Pearl Street corridor study,
Yeah.
I think we wait till that one flushes out, but it's going to flush out quick here, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, it's fair to point out that, we've been having a lot of discussion about several different functional areas of this ordinance, and there's, one of the other things that has come up recently, relatively recently, is that the entire ordinance was E-code, was E-codified. And so there were no substantive text changes made to the ordinance. However, some of the sections were renumbered. to have consistent formatting, article to article. So, and an example of that would be something that was listed as 205.01 is now .1. So, and .02 to 09 were kind of missing, and then it would go to like .11. So some of those sections were cleaned up, now they're just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then some subsections would start out with, well, there's section 1, subsection 1, 2, 3, and that formatting has also been cleaned up so that it's consistent to go from numbers to letters to numbers. So you would have section 1, ABC, and then maybe potentially subsection 1, 2, 3. So those have been cleaned up, and I think that we need to, in conversations with the solicitor's office, that we want to have council formally ratify the updated e-codified ordinance as well, just to recognize those numbers, because what happens is, I have this book that is from July of 2023 that has all the old numbering and lettering, and this book is, some of the sections are slightly different. The verbiage is exactly the same.
Yeah.
But some of the numbering is different, so when you're referring to sections of the ordinance, it could cause some conflict, or at the very least, some misunderstanding, or when you're trying to refer to one section that has two numbers in two different books. So we are also going to need to do that. I know the solicitor's office is working on preparing an ordinance that would just essentially ratify that, that this would be the new recognized format and numbering. What I'm hoping is we can package some of these things up and have these other textual changes done, either at the same time, or, maybe they're considered separately but can be done at the same time. That's kind of more of a administrative thing on how many ordinances do we actually write, or does this all get
Right,
lumped
yeah.
into one big ordinance for council to consider, to say, hey, we want to get the E-code thing, ratified, and then we also want to make these text changes. We haven't really been discussing map changes, but I think like the 12th Street project is going to give us some ideas there on map changes. If at this point we're still saying, well, all of our districts are going to remain in place, then, I think we can dig into, if we do want to consider consolidating any of the districts, looking at that at the same time as we look at how do we reflect that in the map. Do we, we may want to massage the district locations if we are. One thing that's come to mind for me in looking at the use categories, and if you look at the difference between C1 and C4, they're both kind of low impact commercial districts, and they're very, very similar as far as the use lists are concerned. And it's one thing that came to my mind and that I've thought about in administering this book for several years, is that maybe that would be a good opportunity to say, you want to have a central business district, obviously. You want to have a general commercial district, again, obviously. But this local commercial district does make sense to have a lower impact commercial district, some of these smaller kind of neighborhood main streets, so to speak.
Yep.
But do we need two different ones? Could we consolidate
Simplify things. a bit for everyone.
that into one local commercial district, and then make sure that the use list is massaged to make sense for, the physical locations of those corridors, because they are located in different parts of the city, but the character of those streets is similar but not identical. So it's something for
There's
us, I
enough
think, to look
overlap
at.
that, yeah, it's worth looking at.
Yeah, I think it's something for us to look at, and maybe kind of in the bigger picture, look at the overall map, and see, do we have enough land available in every one of these districts to accommodate demand? I mean, that's the bottom line, is what this map should be, the zoning map. So I think we can dig into that, and it'll all dovetail together. On the, to finish up on the recommendations on the residential side, obviously, accessory dwelling unit is a new use, so we need to add that as a defined use in Article 6. I did a little digging around to try and find, it's actually sometimes a little more difficult to find model ordinances with the kinds of uses that you're exactly looking for, but I think this is a pretty typical definition for an accessory dwelling unit. Seems to make the most sense. Defined as a dwelling unit with provisions for sleeping, cooking, and sanitation whose use is secondary to that of the principal dwelling or building on the same lot. In other words, that would kind of help to capture if we add that as a permitted use in the commercial districts, because then you're just saying if it might be a live-work type situation where the principal use of the building is commercial, but so that definition serves that. It doesn't say dwelling, just dwelling. It says or building. ADUs further defined as follows. I don't know that we need to put this in there, but I wanted to put that out there for you guys to consume just because it seemed to be a pretty standard kind of sub-definition of the use. Whether or not we leave it in the book or not is, you know, I don't know that it's necessary, but I guess it helps to explain that there are different scenarios in which we would say that fits.
It covers all the possible combinations, I think.
Yeah.
Should we limit the number of ADUs? Like right now, we're not really saying that. We're
There's
saying
still the
singular.
lot coverage
Yeah.
requirements that would limit how much.
But I'm
or
thinking
how
the
many.
interior ones. There's a max limit.
Yeah.
We can't have.
You
We
have
hit,
the
we hit our
density.
own zoning limit at some point, right?
Right.
You have the per family, the square footage per family too, though, that would cut into it.
Should it say a single dwelling unit?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, the goal isn't to create a mini development on a particular lot.
Right. Like mini condos.
Yeah, right.
Does somebody take advantage of there not being a limitation?
Yeah. I mean, I think that limiting it to one on a lot makes sense.
Like if your neighbor built an ADU, you don't want to take issue with one, but if all of a sudden you've got
Stacking them up, right?
3 or 4
Yeah.
behind you, then
Right.
it's
Right.
changed the dynamics of
Yeah, I
things.
mean, like you think about it, the goal is really for, you know, if you have elder family members or
Right.
somebody visiting, you have space for that. It's not meant to be something that turns into a, you know, commercial venture of I've got 8 of them stacked high and,
Right.
you know, going up.
Yeah, but right now we have no limiting
Yeah.
language, so.
Yeah.
And I think we can, I don't know that we would need to create another conditional section. I think if we added that as a caveat to the definition, that might cover that.
The words, if you just add the word single to make it the second word, a single dwelling unit.
Right? I mean, if we want to be a little more, if we want to be more explicit, then, you know, we could add a D or something like that that says, you know, ADUs shall be limited to 1 per lot.
I'm all for ADUs.
Yeah.
I'm just,
Yeah.
Yeah.
at some point there's a.
No, you're right.
Yeah.
No.
You're defeating yourself.
Well, you're right, and then this is surprisingly the only time this has come up kind of consistently where we have a use listed in the book, and then there's nothing in the book that really says that there's a limit, is accessory buildings, sheds. There's nothing in the book that literally says you're not allowed to have more than one. So, you know, lot coverage is kind of a cross-check to that you can't just cover the entire lot with sheds. But, you know, there's
There's
folks
a
that have
loophole.
3, 4, 5 sheds, you know, and, you know, so you can kind of skirt some of the, you know, accessory buildings have size and height limits, but, there's folks that have multiple accessory buildings because they need the storage space, and as long as they meet the other specs, they're okay.
Yeah, storage is one thing,
It
but
hasn't
if
caused any conflicts that I'm
Yeah.
aware of, honestly, but it's the only time that I've thought about it. It's like,
If you had more than 3 ADUs on your site, then you technically are flexing yourself into a different R category.
Yeah, oh, yeah, yeah, and obviously an accessory storage building is a much different, completely different. But, yeah, it's just one of those things that, you know, in my mind, it's one of those things that because we don't have, it's one thing to set minimums, but if, you know, sometimes you also have to set maximums, and that was even going back to our setback
Yeah,
conversations. You know, there's no maximums listed, and sometimes you want to have that, and, you know, unless you want to define an exact zero setback, which we do have in a couple spots, you know, but,
It's, I mean, saying that we have, permitting one ADU makes sense to me because you have single-family uses, and you can add an ADU to it. And to make it two, it just makes a single with it.
Yeah.
And you can have a two-unit, two-family dwelling, typical up and down, that you could add an ADU to, a single ADU to. You can't, every unit doesn't get,
Yeah.
yeah, and you would
Yeah.
think it's kind of implied to say, you know, well, it's an accessory dwelling. You would think it's kind of implied, well, it's one, and
Yeah.
you would, but I think you might want to explicitly say limit
Yeah.
one per lot.
Yeah, we have a singular right now, but yeah, it's not.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean-
because it's residential, and, you know, I mean, obviously, we're trying to increase the flexibility of residential uses in the city, you know, and this is a big step to do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, to make that clarified, I think that's a
It's
very good
units, not
recommendation.
units.
yeah, it's unit, and not units, that's right.
Right.
Um,
Let's see, let me just run through the rest of on the definition sides of things that help to correspond with the use recommendations. Obviously, on the childcare side of things, looking at amending our existing definitions to line up with the state definitions per our conversation from last month. So that's what you see there. We've already had daycare center and family daycare listed, so it was just a matter of amending those definitions to line up with the states. And then, since we were missing a category, we've added that, which is the group child care home. Yeah, so it looks like I'm kind of replacing the word day with child. Home child care, you know, the state does not regulate if you're watching up to 3 kids. So home child care is not a definition in the state child care regulations. So it's there, and we currently have it listed as a permitted use in a lot of different districts. It's essentially unregulated unless we want to, and this I'm not sure of, but I'm not sure that we're requiring home child care to be registered in our daycare program. That's a question for Andy and Christie. I don't think that we are because it's unregulated by the state. I think that our
How would you
current
know?
Yeah,
daycare.
that's what I was gonna say.
Right.
It's
Find
fine,
out if it's not regulated
Right.
any other way.
So we can eliminate it. I mean, we can add that to this recommendation that the home child care category just be eliminated from the ordinance.
I think with us bringing the other definitions in line with the state, it makes sense to keep with that trend and just strike this altogether.
Yeah, it's, you know, unless we're gonna regulate it, I don't see the utility of it, the purpose of it. So, I mean,
does profit or nonprofit affect whether the state regulates it or not?
I don't believe so.
Okay. Then I think I would I would agree about striking it, because technically, if you have,
Teenager babysitting in the summers?
right, or your kid invites three friends over, you know,
Technically,
yeah,
yeah,
you know,
I'm with you there.
yeah, I just,
And I think when the state, I mean, I think this has been pretty standard even before the state updated these
Yeah.
a couple of years ago. I mean, the numbers of kids that, you know, where if you are wanting your daycare operation to be recognized by the state and potentially having your, having subsidies available to the folks that are providing the daycare, you know, these numbers have always been the same. So the up to 3 kids is, to my knowledge, has not ever been regulated. As far as having to go in and inspect homes and,
Right.
you know, provide any certification or licensing to folks that are watching a couple of kids.
well, and it also removes the appearance that the city has an obligation
Yeah.
to regulate them,
That's a good point.
certify them, so.
Okay. So then we would move to strike that use. Delete that use from the zoning districts. Okay. On the, going back, and I'll skip over family for a second, but to go back to our conversations from last month also on the, you know, we did not have a definition for group home. You know, we've moved the group home designation to permitted in the residential districts, and that's really to comply with the Fair Housing Act and just something that, you know, in practice, we haven't, you know, really been making any people jump through hoops for group homes, but we definitely wanted to move that, and that's been done. But we also needed to put a good definition in there. So the definition that I've put together here is similar to our group care facility definition. I think a lot of the same standards need to be applied. However, the real difference between group home and group care facility is that this is in a, you know, you have to look at the setting and the structure and the neighborhood. So group homes, I think, are intended to be in a residential structure, in a dwelling, and operated as a single-family dwelling. When you look at the definition of family, and you look at D in family, I mean, that's really what it's alluding to, is permanent group homes. So I wanted to make sure that that residential dwelling status was included in the definition of group home. So that's what you'll see in the second sentence there, that the services shall be provided in a residential dwelling unit in a family-like living arrangement. I think it's a very comprehensive definition for group home that supports, you know, there won't be any questions.
No, I thought it was good.
And on, going back to our conversation again, where we've had group care facility and group residence facility that essentially the exact same definition. So the suggestion there is to, per our conversation, delete the group residence facility use, since it's essentially covered under group care facility. So under, one other thing that we've discussed in the past was also under the definition of family. And then, and again, to provide some more flexibility in housing options for folks. We talked about the
Students?
well, yeah, in particular, since we, you know, could be argued we're a college town, right? We've discussed increasing that number, that maximum number of unrelated persons that occupy a single-family dwelling from 3 to 4. And so that's what's suggested here. That requires that the only thing we have to do to put that in effect is amend the definition. So under C in the definition of family, you'll see it says no more than 3. The recommendation would be to increase that to 4. And the corresponding definition that needs to be amended as well is the definition of rooming boarding home, because that also refers to the number of unrelated folks. And that's also been cleaned up and simplified to line up with other definitions that I've found. And essentially, the main part of that definition is listing the number of unrelated persons. So that, of course, goes from 4 to 5. So rooming homes, rooming houses would be for no more than, or for 5 or more unrelated folks. And I guess related to the group home thing, you know, we've had folks that have said, I want to start a group home, and without having a definition for group home and relying on the family definition for group homes, and looking at our other group care criteria, I think it was important to note that the person that or the entity that operates a group home or a group care facility you do have to be a certain type of entity.
Yeah. It's not just an open door for
It's
anyone
not
to
just,
do it.
well, I
There's
just want to have
licensing
a
and-
bunch of unrelated people living here and I think they're handicapped, so I'm going to call it a group home. There's a set of standards that need to be applied. Because we have had, I know we're not, there's still a couple other areas that we've talked about that we haven't quite gotten to the finish line on with things like perhaps emergency shelters or transitional housing, and that's not included here. I think we need to do a little bit more digging on that to get there. But I think this helps to really clean up a very kind of functional area in the city, that those distinguishments are made. So that's the recommendations on amendments for the permitted uses in the residential districts. You will see one other use there that under 13 that is kind of miscellaneous, but I put it in there because and maybe we can start going a little further with talking about the commercial and industrial districts with some of the uses, to make those a little more permissive as well, for lack of a better term.
I think it makes sense. If we're doing residential, I think it doesn't hurt to look at taking the same approach to the businesses that are supporting the economy too.
Right. And you know, these are very, obviously what's being presented today is things that, these are very practical, easy fixes, and in some cases just kind of updating to current standards and to current language, you know. So that's that. I've noted the other changes with adding the accessory dwelling units, with eliminating the home child care definition and use, adding a sub descriptor to accessory dwelling unit about the limit, 1 per lot. I think that's going to be good.
How did we feel? I mean, I am in agreement on the ADUs in C1 and C4. I know we're going to look at, obviously, should those be, in fact, one district rather than 2, that overlap. But I think at least for the ADU discussion, it makes sense to add those in there as permitted uses.
Mm-hmm. I would agree.
And M1.
Yeah.
And M1, yeah.
M1.
Thanks.
Yeah, I like that.
Oh, yeah.
That provides kind of that live work opportunity that we can apply in those districts. I think that's perfect, because I've seen a couple of them. Not a lot of them, but I've seen a couple of them come in.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I have to present. I know that we've got some other items that are still basically under review. And I don't know if we want to have some more discussion on any of those areas at this point. I know we've also had, and probably the easiest thing to perhaps transition to, I know we've had some discussions about off-street parking requirements and in looking at, do we want to reduce or even eliminate off-street parking requirements for some of the uses or perhaps even all of the uses?
I mean, in looking at that, at least on that topic, and maybe that's worthy of a discussion, a longer discussion later, but that's one of those things that I think it makes sense in residential, but you go much further beyond that, we're creating an absolute nightmare.
I don't know about that.
Oh, yeah.
Hotels? I
It's
mean,
up to you're giving it to them, them the keys to decide how many
that's fair.
spots they need.
I think so. I think that, and most hotel franchises have a requirement of one
There
per
you go.
guest room.
Yeah.
I mean, those are taking, business owner knows his business.
Yeah, I'm all for
Right.
cutting out whatever we can to simplify it and encourage.
If I'm
Yeah.
an urban hotel and I got a public parking garage across the street, you're gonna tell me I gotta build
True.
parking spaces?
Yeah.
I don't know,
That's
I can
fair.
find an argument against
Well,
it.
and
You don't have to convince me, that's a good point.
just to be, in looking at the existing regs, so the off-street parking regs, I've looked in the past, I've looked several times over the past few years and recently at how the city's off-street requirements stack up against other urban areas and other similar areas and similar uses. And I've not found anything that's way out of line. And what you would hope for is that the city is a little bit more permissive. And that's what I've found in most cases. I haven't seen any of these uses where the city's off-street requirements, parking requirements were more restrictive, which is good, which is really good.
I think to some extent, it's more just what are we trying to create in these neighborhoods and making them more, people out and about and community oriented. One of the,
Right.
a lot of kind of the thinking is eliminating off-street parking requirements helps to develop more walkable neighborhoods.
Well, and keep in mind that currently there are no off-street parking requirements in place for C3, for the downtown business district. So you are not, for any new use, you are not required to provide any additional parking, which is good. And then in the local, it says C4, which I think we would want to apply to the other local, that you only have to provide 50% of which again is, that's helpful as well, and also in WC2 and WC3. Now, WC2 is essentially the Hammett campus, so it's essentially part of downtown in the WC district anyway. So it makes sense that those parking requirements have been, they're eased up in those districts or eliminated. We could perhaps expand that under change of use. For parking, if a use is legally changed to another use, the new use will not be required to provide additional parking. So that's as far as and essentially the city is largely built out. So if you change the use of the property, you don't have to worry about it, but any of these parking requirements, you're exempt.
Population is contracting, there's
Yeah.
forever less demand.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, and that's obviously what we're seeing, 95% of what we're seeing development-wise is redevelopment and reuse of the existing properties, the existing buildings on the properties, I should say. There is one statement that I think we would want to change for parking and to make it more permissive, because under mixed uses, it's the last section of the off-street parking requirements. It says that in the case of mixed-use buildings, the parking facility shall be the sum of the requirements for the various individual uses, computed separately. In other words,
That's too much.
It's disallowing shared parking.
Right.
Which I'm a big proponent of shared parking. And, practically speaking, that's what most of the businesses that are sharing, strip plazas, for instance, is a good example of that. Most of them are doing that. And, but we would not want any new development to have to say, well, you know what? You need 50, you need 20, you need 10, you know, and add all that up when in fact, especially if they operate during different hours, they can use the
Right.
same spaces.
The
So
goal,
I
the
think
goal
we're
of
all
mixed use is to
proponents
attract
of that.
the other businesses, customers to come to your business, so.
Yeah, and so I would, my suggestion there, under the existing language, would be to either eliminate that or modify it to actually make a statement about shared parking. You know, that it's, that shared parking is permitted. So, I mean, I can look a little bit more into if there's a good statement, a replacement statement that kind of helps talk about the shared parking scenario, or just eliminate that mixed use
I mean,
scenario.
I'm all
I'm not
for
sure what the better
eliminating-
solution is, but
Let's get
we
rid of it.
definitely want to remove that. It's just a matter of, do we want to replace that with some sort of shared parking statement?
I think every business owner, developer is going to provide the minimum amount of parking they need for their businesses to function.
Right.
Irrelevant of us.
Yeah, because I know
dictate-
nobody's going to go there.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
if they think they need no parking, they should be able to not have to build parking. And that,
Right.
If they think
Yeah,
they
and the
need,
businesses that are investing in downtown, I mean, they're relying on the existing parking. And they've made that determination before they open
Oh,
up
yeah.
shop.
I'm all for getting rid of it.
let's kill it.
Yeah,
Dead.
So that's, I think we're in a good place there. I think we want to continue to look at that and look at the uses like I said, I haven't found anything that's really onerous. But I think, you know, there's no harm in continuing to look at that. And if anything, I think that mixed-use statement was probably the most prohibitive when it came to off-street parking. So, I mean, yeah, I think we definitely, that would be good deletions. Another conversation that we had a bit was looking at density, looking at the density requirements. This again related to the residential side of things. And I apologize, I did not give you guys copies of the lot and yard requirements, but just for an example, in R1, R1A, R2, R3, RLB, you know, R1, the minimum lot density is 6,000 square feet, which essentially corresponds with the minimum lot size. However, any existing lot of record can be developed as a single-family residential unit, so regardless of the size of it. So, and in cases in R1 where the lot is, I believe it's 41 feet or less, and then the setback requirements are reduced as well. So that you don't tell somebody that's like, well, you only have 20 feet to work with. So that in practice has worked well. I have not had anybody look at developing a vacant lot in the city that I had to tell them they couldn't do it because of the lot and yard requirements. So that's been good. That has worked. Now in R2, where we allow up to 4 units per lot, sometimes that density requirement will catch people. The interesting thing is the way it's written now in R2 is that you have the same density requirement for a 2-unit as you do a 3-unit. So you need 6,000 square feet for a 2-unit, but you also only need 6,000 square feet for a 3-unit, and then you need 8,000 square feet for a 4-unit. I think if we were looking at maybe reducing some of those density requirements to maybe have some lots be developable for a larger number of units if somebody wants to do a multi
Yeah,
unit.
I think we should look at it 2 ways. We should look at it, one, we want to increase density, right, or allow for increased density.
Right.
But 2, one thing we shouldn't lose in this with the setback requirements is in our historic neighborhoods, there's generally a consistent setback. So if there's an empty lot and somebody comes in and violates that either direction, right, it kind of violates the
Feel the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So how?
And we do have that 5-foot And that's one of the good things in the residential districts, is that there is a requirement to be within 5 feet of the average setback.
Average, yeah.
And so, and
As long as we keep
largely,
that, I think that protects.
It does.
Neighborhood character.
It has.
Prevents any major outliers.
Yeah.
And we have some existing homes that have been there for decades, that there's a couple of houses that are sitting in the back of the property. And then it's like a missing tooth when you're looking at the street, but the house has been there for
Well,
60, 80 years.
One example I'm
And it's
thinking
just
of,
the way it is.
there's a couple townhomes that were built in the West Bayfront recently that have some garages, and they're very suburban style, the scabs in the neighborhood essentially. How do we adjust our setback requirements to force them to meet the average more closely, but to also meet the style of the neighborhood?
Right.
And
Yeah.
there's ways to do that with density and whatnot, and try to discourage the garage out front kind of thing.
Yeah. And
Which
the-
might be fine in southern Erie, but like in West Bayfront or East Bayfront, it just
Right.
doesn't fit, right?
And the garage under development, there's nothing
Yeah.
specific in this ordinance that talks about, having that built-in first floor garage. There is a requirement in this ordinance, however, any garage door that faces the street, anywhere, needs to be a minimum of 20 feet back. And so what I've seen in the residential districts, and a lot of time, because we've had more redevelopment in the waterfront districts, obviously it's been a little more active as far as residential development is concerned, is that sometimes that does not line up with that. You have to be within 5 foot of the average setback of the rest of the houses on that side of the street.
Yeah.
So there's a conflict there. And usually, so you have a conflict between two zoning requirements, you can't meet both at the same time. They end up going to the zoning hearing board to rectify that and ask permission, a dimensional variance, to allow for one or the other, either allow for a variance from the 20-foot setback requirement or from the 5-foot within average setback requirement. The style of, the architectural style, as far as the, like townhousey maybe looking
Yeah, it's harder to
developments, is
force.
kind of a separate issue.
Yeah, without design
obviously,
standards, it's
but-
harder to force that. I'm just,
Yeah.
it's, the garage out front, I feel like we can, if it doesn't sync up with that setback requirement, we can kind of force them to, let's get that back, right? It should be back further than 20 feet in some of
Yeah,
those cases.
and I'm sure that the 20-foot requirement, essentially that kind of lines up with, essentially your standard parking size is
Yeah.
like 10 by 20, 9 by 18, 10 by 20.
Yeah.
So I think that 20-foot length was meant, and that's to the front property line, it's not to the street. It's not to the sidewalk, it's to where the front property line is, which might be in the yard.
Yeah.
So it does force you to move that back. And, when we've seen attached garages go up or detached garages go up, obviously they have to meet that requirement. And so we are not getting that. There's plenty of alleys that have garages that, the garage doors are right on the alley, and folks are, if they're actually storing their vehicles in there, it's probably kind of a tough in and out,
Yeah.
but it's on an alley, and there's obviously other, right up front garages in the city, and I'm sure it's kind of a tough in and out, because you're basically pulled out in the street before you can see maybe, but those two things do come into play together occasionally in the residential districts, for sure. I know we have some on the density side, we have some recommendations. We haven't really had time to fully vet those out yet, but I think that is going to make sense too, I think, maybe to allow for that increased density. I'll just make sure that
Yeah.
that lines up with everything else. And, let's see. Okay, yeah. Right, we touched on some of the density with that, okay. That's what I was looking for. Okay. So we'll take a second look at the density requirements and the density suggestions that we're pushing around here, see what we can come up with. I think that's all I have.
Okay. Since Ms. Spry is not here, I assume we have nothing on planning and neighborhood resources.
I guess I would say one thing. Before we leave the zoning ordinance amendments, do we want to make any motions on the what was presented today? Or do we want to try and put some other things together for the next meeting?
Let's try to do them all.
Yeah.
Okay,
Make one
okay.
large,
That makes sense.
yeah. Okay,
Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
all right. Any public comment?
Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks, Kathy. Adjournment. Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Thanks.
Thank you for everyone for a long, complicated meeting.